Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm back. Nick DiMartino, host of Out of Line. I do want to talk a little bit about CJ Stroud. The NFL draft season is upon us, or almost coming up in about a week and a half or so. So I do want to talk a little bit about CJ Stroud. I do find this to be kind of interesting because going into today, I thought I was under the impression that Stroud was overwhelmingly likely going to be the number one pick. Now, because I know that Frank Reich really likes Stroud, um, I will say though, now I'm just as convinced that he's not going to go number one because I checked the betting odds and it's Bryce Young minus 1400 and CJ Stroud plus 700. So Vegas obviously knows something. If it seems pretty clear to me based on that. Now, it could change within the next week and a half. That's an eternity in the world of sports. But as of now, it seems very overwhelmingly likely that CJ Stroud is is not going to go number one. It's going to be Bryce Young. And like I said, Frank Reich really likes Stroud, loves Stroud, but David Tepper really loves Bryce Young. And it's pretty safe to say that if the owner says one thing and the head coach says another, unless that head coach is named Bill Belichick, the owner is going to get his way over the head coach, most likely. So it seems, and also minus 1400 versus plus 700. I mean, it's a little bit too clear right now that Bryce Young is probably going to go number one over Stroud, even though I like Stroud better. I think he's probably a better player, but it's really besides the point. I think that overall, I think I think Stroud is the best quarterback in the draft. Granted, that doesn't say much because this week's draft class I think is very weak, and it's certainly possible that you can have a draft class where none of the quarterbacks end up being any better than serviceable starters. And looking back, we may look at this and say, look, Bryce Young in 2 years, we might say Bryce Young number one, CJ Stroud number two. In hindsight, feels extremely goofy. It's similar to how we look back on the 2015 NFL draft with Winston and Mariota. Neither of those guys were even able to start throughout most of their careers. So that's certainly not out of it's certainly not beyond the pale that something like that would happen. I mean, even if we look at a guy like Stroud and say he's the best in this particular draft class, I mean, this draft class might just not be very good, which so far I'm convinced of. But I will say, I think that it doesn't seem exactly clear where Stroud is going to go because I looked at the number two draft. Now, there's not odds listed for every single one of these, for every single number in the draft pick, I mean. Because it could just not be clear enough where Vegas can't even really do anything with it. But Will Anderson is actually most likely to be the number two pick in the draft at plus 150, and CJ Stroud is plus 275. So it's not even so far of all the picks listed, and number three is not listed. And at number four, CJ Stroud is plus 350. And number three, like I said, is not listed. So of all the picks that are listed on, and I'm looking at DraftKings, CJ Stroud is most likely to go number two. But even at the number two pick, he's not even the most likely to be the number two in the pick. The number two pick. In other words, Stroud is most likely to be the number two pick of all the picks, but he's not even the most likely number two draft pick. So, which opens up a lot of doors and, speculation and all that. In terms of how good of a player he is, in terms of, I mean, here's the thing with draft picks. I think that there's a technical side of it on what their skills are, and then there's context that needs to be taken into account. That might be a little bit different from my so-called analysis of how good of a player he is in terms of his skill set. He, of all the quarterbacks in the draft, he seems to have the best arm. He has a very good arm, very good pocket presence, especially for an Ohio State quarterback, like in terms of his NFL skills. And he is very accurate. And from watching him in college, that is certainly true. And you can't really teach accuracy. I mean, you either have a big arm and neither of those things, having a strong arm and having an accurate arm, neither of those things can really be taught. I mean, you're kind of just, you have it in you or you don't. And Stroud seems to have it in him. He also, I mean, you can see it from, he's especially good throwing from out of the pocket and keeping his accuracy. You can see from his game in Georgia.
Plenty of time for Stroud. Directing receivers, flips it to the end zone. Caught! Touchdown!
Harrison was wide open either. He was, I mean, that's a very tough play to make. Most quarterbacks can't really do that. So that's very difficult for him to do. And a very similar thing right here.
Caught a touchdown last week. Got a couple of passes early in the game today. Stroud throwing. This time it's for Marvin Harrison Jr. And it's a trifecta.
Outside the pocket, obviously, both those to Marvin Harrison Jr. So in terms of his actual skill set, I think he's a pretty good NFL caliber player. And the biggest weakness he seems to have, according to all the experts, is that, and also from my experience watching him, is that he's hesitant to run. I mean, that's, for an NFL player, that is certainly one of the better weaknesses you can have. I mean, we often hear things about how players have low football IQs, or they can't throw from the pocket, or they don't have good arms. Of all of the weaknesses to have, being unwilling to run as an NFL quarterback is actually one of the better weaknesses you can have, because more often than not, quarterbacks are criticized for running too much and not being hesitant enough to run. And even if you do want them to run more, that's something you can kind of teach. So in terms of how good I do think, like I said, he seems like the best quarterback in the draft, at least in my opinion. David Tepper would disagree. But I will say, in spite of all of what I just said, in terms of how he has a lot of NFL skill sets, the other side of it is that you have to look at certain nuance and a lot of context and using your own judgment and going with your gut. And that leads me to a different conclusion, which is that I don't think he's going to be much better than a serviceable starter throughout his career. And most great college quarterbacks don't really do any better than that. I'm not saying he's going to be horrible, but kind of a bust. I'm not saying he's going to be Zach Wilson, but I think we might forget about him in a couple of years. Not forget about him. He'll be around, but I could see him not end up being that good. First of all, part of it is just my bias against Ohio State quarterbacks. Similar to how I feel about USC quarterbacks, Ohio State quarterbacks tend to not be that good in the NFL, at least in recent years. Now, I'm not saying that can't change. Maybe Justin Fields will pan out, although I don't really think of him exactly as an Ohio State quarterback. I sort of think of him as like a hybrid Georgia-Ohio State quarterback. He wasn't really developed in Ohio State necessarily. He started off in Georgia, but either way, you also have to consider a lot of other context, which is the fact that, I mean, this is pretty obvious, but college defenses are much easier than NFL defenses. And when you play at a team, when you play for a program like Ohio State, you have the best coaching staff, the best the best coordinators, the best receivers, the best everything. I mean, CJ Stroud had the best receiving core of everybody in college football when he was at Ohio State. So that needs to be taken into account. I mean, it needs to be taken into account that he had the best receiving core and played in a system that fit him very well. And that's not always going to translate perfectly to the NFL. And the game is different to the point where it's like there's not always that much of a correlation between being great in college and being great in the NFL. I mean, there's a little bit of a correlation, but I don't think most of the time really good quarterbacks like CJ Stroud end up being great in the NFL. Like if you look at a player like Joe Burrow, who's great in college, okay, he's probably going to be great in the NFL. But the game is just different. And even really good Ohio State quarterbacks, players who, like, I mean, it's not like they have bad quarterbacks. They usually have really good quarterbacks. In fact, they pretty much always have really good quarterbacks. I don't remember them ever having a bad quarterback. Even their backups tend to be good. And they don't turn out to be good in the NFL most of the time. I mean, the best Ohio State quarterback that I saw was Cardale Jones. I think. I mean, or at least for a certain stretch, he was the best quarterback. Not in terms of his career, but in terms of the stretch that stretch that he had when he was Ohio State's third string quarterback and they ended up winning the national championship. That was the best I've seen from an Ohio State quarterback. And what happened? I mean, is he even in the league anymore? Did he ever even start? I know he was on the Bills for a little bit. I don't remember. I'm not even 100% sure, to be honest, if he's still in the NFL. So all of that needs to be taken into account. Now, just because other Ohio State quarterbacks have been flubs in the past doesn't mean Stroud is also going to be a flub. But it is pattern recognition, and it makes sense for me to think that he probably is going to – I mean, he's probably not going to be that great if other Ohio State quarterbacks weren't that great. In terms of the teams that they fit best, I think that the teams that Stroud would fit in best would be teams with probably offensive-minded head coach, really good coaches who are in weak divisions. So, he doesn't like a team like the Panthers. I really think the Panthers pretty well. Right. In a good division. And they could go 8-9 and make the playoffs. So it's not like for a team like the Panthers, there's a lot of room for error, even though, like I said, it looked like he's going to go number one. But also, another team, or even a team like the Texans, I mean, he might go number two. There's a good chance a team like the Texans, I think, would be a pretty good fit for him. But another team that I was thinking, don't think he's likely to drop to number 5. Another team, and I don't think they would even draft it. I'm not even sure they would draft it. I don't know. Would be the Seahawks, because Seattle, they do have a good quarterback type of system. And I think that they're probably be. I mean, look what they did with G. Smith. So the Seahawks would be a really good fit. I mean, if you're going to go to a team like the Jets or something like that, I don't think it would work out. I think he'd be pretty bad. But so I guess we'll see what happens in a week and a half. By the way, these odds might change. David Tepper might change his mind and say, Frank, you're right. We should take Stroud. But right now, it looks like he's not going number 1.